Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 28 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, the HMS Resolution reached the island of Huahine after leaving behind the lush shores of Tahiti. Though the landscape resembled Tahiti in many ways, the island was smaller, the mountains steeper, and the people more reserved. Cook and his men received a ceremonial welcome from the local chief Ori, including a ritual exchange of gifts and a relic from Cook's first voyage, a pewter plate from the Endeavour. The trade proved successful, yielding pigs, dogs, and cloth. Meanwhile, Georg explored the island, observed animal life, and noted how islanders treated birds and dogs with affection and reverence. As they moved along the northern shore of the harbor, they witnessed a moment of abundance. So many pigs were offered for sale that the entire crew could be supplied with fresh meat. With fruit and vegetables scarce, yams became their daily bread. By the end of the day, their boats were filled to the brim with goods, thanks in part to Cook's skillful negotiations. The episode closed with a revealing comparison between the islanders of Huahine and Tahiti. Less generous, perhaps, but also more composed and confident. The balance between curiosity and dignity in these new encounters set the stage for the next chapter in their Pacific journey.
Sunday, September 5th, 1773, Huahine.
The next morning, Ori came aboard with his sons. The eldest, a handsome boy of about 11, accepted the gifts with great indifference. However, like everyone else on the island, he was absolutely delighted by the sound of the bagpipes and asked that they be played continuously. During Captain Cook's earlier visit, Ori had adopted the name Kuki, and even now he insisted on being called that. After their distinguished guest had spent some time on board, Georg and the others accompanied him back ashore. They then split into separate groups to search for plants and other interesting things. That evening, when they all gathered again, Dr. Sparrmann shared the details of his solo journey to the northern tip of the island. There he had come upon a large saltwater lagoon, several kilometers long, running parallel to the coastline, but surrounded by foul, marshy sludge that gave off an unbearable stench. In that area, he had discovered several plant species that were common in East India, but rare in the other South Sea islands. The islander who carried his specimens had proven remarkably loyal. Whenever Sparrmann sat down to describe a plant, the man would position himself behind him and hold the folds of his coat tightly with both hands, claiming he wanted to guard the doctor's pockets against thieves. Thanks to this precaution, nothing was stolen. However, some other locals jeered at the doctor with mocking words and twisted faces, likely thinking there was little risk in teasing someone who was all alone. The next day, Sparrmann went for another walk by himself, while Captain Cook and the rest of the group remained in the market square. Suddenly, a local man named Tubai pushed his way through the crowd. He was dressed in large pieces of red cloth and had bundles of bird feathers hanging from his belt. Tubai forbade the people from selling pigs or breadfruit to the visitors. Then he grabbed a bag of nails from the ship's clerk. When the man shouted for help, Tubai let go, but immediately stole a nail from one of the younger men who was trying to buy a chicken and threatened to knock him down if he resisted. Captain Cook, who had already been on his way back to the ship, turned around as soon as he heard what had happened. He insisted that Tubai leave the marketplace immediately. When the man refused, Cook approached him and seized the 2 clubs he was holding. Tubai resisted at first, but as soon as Cook drew his hanger, the islander ran off. Following Cook's orders, the wooden clubs made of casuarina were broken and thrown into the sea. The islanders seemed worried this incident might have serious consequences. Many began to leave the square, but they were called back. All agreed that Tubai was a tata ihno, a bad man, and appeared to believe the crew had acted justly. Still, the moment Cook boarded the boat to fetch a guard of Marines, the whole crowd suddenly scattered. At first the crew couldn't understand why, but within moments the answer came running toward them, Dr. Sparrmann, nearly naked and clearly injured. He had been walking inland with 2 locals who had approached him in friendship, calling him Tayo, and inviting him further into the interior. Without warning, they snatched his hanger, his only weapon, and when he bent down to pick up a stone, they struck him on the head and knocked him to the ground. Then they stripped off his vest and whatever clothing they could pull off. Though Sparrmann managed to get away and run toward the coast, he got his foot caught in some underbrush. The attackers caught up, beat him again, some blows landing on his temple, and pulled his shirt over his head, planning to cut off his hands. Luckily, he regained consciousness just in time and tore open the sleeves with his teeth, forcing the robbers to flee with what they had. Only 100 steps away, some islanders were peacefully eating their lunch. They called for Sparrmann to sit with them, but he kept running. A little further on, 2 more locals saw him in distress, took off their own ahwas, cloaks, wrapped him in them, and escorted him back to the square. These good men were generously rewarded. Then the entire crew hurried back to the ship, intending to return to shore with a stronger force. Sparrmann changed into fresh clothes and rejoined the others as they went to Ori's house to lodge their complaint. The old chief was immediately willing to join Captain Cook in searching for the thieves, even though this decision threw all his relatives into fear and sorrow. More than 50 people, men and women, began to weep bitterly as they saw him step into the boat with the Europeans. Some pleaded with him through moving gestures to change his mind. Others clung to him, trying to hold him back. But he remained unmoved and declared as he walked that he had nothing to fear since he had done nothing wrong. To reassure them, Georg's father offered to stay behind as a hostage, but Ori refused and took only one of his relatives on board. Together, they rowed across the bay to a deep inlet directly opposite the ships, near the spot where the robbery had occurred. From there, they marched inland, but the search led nowhere. The men Ori had sent to capture the culprits had not done their duty. Disappointed, the group returned to the ships, and Ori accompanied them. Even the tears of an old woman and her beautiful daughter couldn't dissuade him. When the young woman realized her weeping had no effect, she took some shells in desperation and scratched her forehead until blood ran down her face. Her mother snatched the shells away and followed them, along with Ori, to the ship. Ori enjoyed the food they served him on board, while the woman, according to local custom, refused to eat foreign food. After the meal, the visitors escorted the chief back to his home, where the island's noble families had already gathered. Many of them sat on the ground in grief, some in tears. Deeply moved, the visitors sat among them and did their best to cheer them up, using all the Tahitian phrases they knew. The women were especially distressed and took a long time to recover their composure. The sorrow of the islanders in this situation was such a clear sign of the goodness of their hearts that the visitors couldn't help but share in it sincerely. And when the locals saw how earnestly the foreigners tried to comfort them, they eventually calmed down and regained their trust. Among the many impressions Georg and his companions gathered on this journey, this was one of the most moving: that the people of these islands were not as lost in sensuality as other travelers had falsely claimed. Instead, they displayed sentiments that truly honored humanity. Vice exists among all peoples, but for every wrongdoer Georg and the others met in these islands, they could easily name 50 in England or other so-called civilized countries. Trade, which had been temporarily disrupted by the earlier incident, now resumed with the same liveliness as before. Georg and his fellow travelers managed to acquire a decent supply of fruit and root vegetables. Toward evening, 2 of Ori's messengers returned, bringing Dr. Sparrmann's hunting knife and a piece of his vest, both of which were handed over to the crew. After this, they all returned to the ship. Early the next morning, the 2 captains returned to Ori's house at daybreak. They gave back the tin plate engraved with the inscription commemorating the first discovery of the island. They also presented him with a small copper plaque inscribed, His Britannic Majesty's Ships, Resolution and Adventure, September 1773. In addition, they gifted him some medals and asked that he show them to any future visitors. Upon returning on board, they weighed anchor, and both the Resolution and the Adventure set sail again. During their 3-day stay, they had purchased many live pigs and chickens, proof that the islanders had come to appreciate the value of iron tools. The Resolution alone carried 209 pigs, 30 dogs, and about 50 chickens. The Adventure had nearly as many. Shortly after departing, Ori appeared alongside in a small canoe. He told the visitors he had found the thieves and recovered the rest of the stolen items. Ori invited both captains and Dr. Sparrmann to return ashore and witness the punishment. But they misunderstood his message and missed the chance to observe the nature of local justice. Captain Cook believed Ori wanted to retrieve some people who had joined the Adventure against his will. So he sent a boat to the other ship, but the Adventure had already sailed too far. As the wind quickly carried them further out to sea, Ori took his leave with a warm farewell and returned to shore with just one companion. Soon after, their boat returned from the Adventure and brought Omai on board, the only islander who had chosen to travel to England. Cook kept him aboard the Resolution until they reached Raiatea. There, Omai transferred to the Adventure and continued the journey to Europe, where he later drew considerable public attention. During his time aboard, the officers got to know him as a humble man. He did not mingle with the gentlemen, but stayed close to the sailors. Only when introduced into refined company at the Cape of Good Hope, dressed in his exotic garments, did he present himself as Hiwa, a royal companion. Later, exaggerated stories spread about him, including claims that he had been a priest of the sun, a position unknown in his homeland. He was tall and slender, with particularly delicate and graceful hands. From his facial features, however, one could hardly form any accurate idea of the beauty typically associated with the people of Tahiti. In fact, without doing him any injustice, it can be said that, among all the faces seen on Tahiti and the Society Islands, his was among the most average. Moreover, his complexion was so dark that it was scarcely matched even among the lower classes of the population, and certainly did not correspond with the rank he later claimed for himself. It was truly unfortunate that this particular individual had been chosen as a representative example of a people so widely described by seafarers as fair-skinned and finely built. His heart and mind were of the kind commonly found among his fellow islanders. He was no extraordinary genius like Tupaia, but he possessed a sensitive heart and an open mind that quickly grasped new ideas. He was grateful, compassionate, and spirited, though also somewhat flighty.
Omai was a young man from the island of Raiatea in the Society Islands who became one of the most well-known Pacific islanders to travel to Europe in the 18th century. His journey began during Captain Tobias Furneaux's voyage on the Adventure, part of James Cook's second expedition. In 1773, Omai boarded the Adventure when it visited Huahine, having previously fled from Bora Bora, where his family had suffered under conflict with rival chiefs. When the Adventure reunited with Resolution in New Zealand, Omai transferred to Cook's ship and continued the voyage. He proved to be a quick learner, sociable, and eager to explore the world beyond the Pacific. His presence on board served multiple purposes. He acted as a cultural intermediary, shared his knowledge of Polynesian navigation and customs, and offered European scientists and officers a rare chance to learn from a native perspective. Omai arrived in England in 1774 and quickly became a sensation. He was received by the British aristocracy, dined with royalty, and was even painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds. To many in Britain, Omai represented the noble savage, a figure embodying Enlightenment ideals of natural humanity. However, his stay was also marked by cultural misunderstandings and exoticism. In 1776, Omai returned to the Pacific with Captain Cook's third voyage aboard the Resolution. The British outfitted him with European goods, a house, and servants, hoping he would serve as a living example of their benevolence and foster goodwill between cultures. Sadly, reports from later visitors suggested that Omai struggled to reintegrate into island life. He reportedly died a few years after his return, around 1779, possibly from illness. Omai's story remains significant as one of the earliest and most documented examples of cross-cultural exchange during the Age of Exploration, highlighting both the opportunities and the dislocations that came with global contact.
After they left Huahine, they set course westward and sailed around the southern tip of an island that Captain Cook had discovered in 1769 and labeled as Raiatea on his charts, though the Tahitians and other inhabitants of the Society Islands actually called it Raiatea. The next morning, they anchored at the island through an opening in the reef and spent the entire day maneuvering into the harbor of Huahine. At first glance, the island looked much like Tahiti. Being roughly 3 times larger than Huahine, its plains and mountains were nearly as large as those of the better-known island. Soon, a crowd of islanders surrounded them in many canoes, bringing pigs to sell. But since they had already stocked up on livestock in Huahine, the crew showed little interest and offered only modest goods in exchange. One of the canoes carried a local chief named Oruera, who came from the neighboring island of Bora Bora. He was a truly athletic figure, though he had unusually small hands. His arms were marked with peculiar square patches, his chest, belly, and back covered in long black lines, and his hips and loins were entirely dotted with black. Oruera brought a few green branches and a small piglet, which he gave to Georg's father, since no one else had paid attention to him. After receiving a gift of iron tools in return, the man promptly returned to land in his canoe. Not long after, he sent a second canoe to his new friend, loaded with coconuts and bananas, yet his people refused to accept any return gifts for them. Such selfless generosity delighted the visitors deeply. For anyone who values humanity, there could be no greater joy than to encounter goodness and warmth in a fellow human being. In the afternoon, they were visited by another chief who also came from Bora Bora and took Georg's father's name, while Georg's father had to adopt his. This man was called Hiwa and was the stoutest person they had seen in the South Seas. His waist measured 137 centimeters, and each of his thighs was 81 centimeters in circumference. His hair was also remarkable. It hung in long black wavy braids down to his hips, and was so thick that it made his head appear almost twice its natural size. His corpulence, skin color, and tattoos were, like those of Oruera, signs of his rank, which entitled him, just like the nobility on Tahiti, to laziness and indulgence. At this point, Georg explained how these chiefs from Bora Bora had come to hold power and property in Raiatea. According to Cook's earlier accounts, King Opuni of Bora Bora had conquered not only Raiatea and Otaha, which were enclosed within the same coral reef, but also the island of Maurua, located about 28 kilometers further west. Opuni had distributed a significant portion of these conquered lands to his warriors and other subjects as a reward. He had allowed the defeated king of Raiatea, named Uuru, to retain his title and dignity, but had limited his control to the district of Opoa. To Taha, Opuni sent a relative named Boba to act as vice-king. During this political upheaval, many islanders fled to Huahine and Tahiti, hoping one day to liberate their homeland. Tupaya and Omai, both originally from Raiatea, and later passengers aboard English ships, seemed to have had the goal of freeing their oppressed country. They had hoped to acquire firearms in England. Had Tupaia survived, he might have realized this plan. But Omai lacked the foresight and understanding to grasp European warfare and apply it to the needs of his people. Nevertheless, he was so fixated on the idea of liberating his homeland that he had often declared in England, if Captain Cook did not assist him in this mission, he would make sure his countrymen refused to supply the captain with food. He held firmly to this resolution until just before his departure, when, after much persuasion, he began to adopt more peaceful views. They could not understand what had led a man like King Opuni to become a conqueror. According to everyone from Bora Bora, their island was just as fertile and pleasant as the lands they had taken by force. Ambition seemed the only explanation, even though it clashed with the simplicity and noble character of the people. It was yet another sad proof that even among the best of human societies, great imperfections and weaknesses could still be found. On the second day of their stay, they accompanied the captains to a large house near the water, where Raiatea, the chief of that district, lived. He was sitting inside with his family and many people of rank on the floor. As soon as Georg and his companions had taken a seat beside them, a large crowd of islanders immediately gathered around, and the press of bodies quickly made it unbearably hot. Raiatea was a stout man of medium height, with a thin reddish-brown beard. His eyes were strikingly lively and intelligent, and he joked and laughed heartily with the visitors, without taking on any stiff formality or affected manners. His wife was an older woman, while their son and daughter were around 12 to 14 years old. The daughter had an unusually fair complexion and in general showed little of the typical features of her people. Her nose was especially well-shaped, and her eyes could have made one think she was Chinese. Though not tall, her body was graceful and well-proportioned. Her hands were remarkably beautiful, but her legs and feet were somewhat thick, and the short-cut hair did not suit her. Still, she had a very pleasant manner, and like many of her countrywomen, a gentle and agreeable voice. It was impossible to refuse her when she asked for glass beads or other small trinkets. However, since they had not come ashore to sit in a house, the crew soon got up and walked under the trees to shoot birds and collect plants. To their delight, they found among the common people what had been missing in Huahine, the trust and open friendliness of the Tahitians, yet without their constant begging. After dinner, they went for another walk and shot several kingfishers. On the way back from the hunt, they encountered Raiatea, his family, and Captain Cook, walking together through the plain. Raiatea paid no attention to the bird they were carrying, but his beautiful daughter mourned the death of her Iatua and ran away when they came near her with it. Her mother and the other women seemed no less saddened by the incident. When they were about to return to the ship, Raiatea asked them in a serious tone not to kill any more kingfishers or herons on his island. They could hunt other birds as they pleased. The crew tried once again to ask why these two kinds of birds were so revered, but as before they received no clear answer. The next day they climbed one of the nearby mountains. On the way through the valleys, the explorers found several new plants. The summit consisted of a type of yellowish claystone. On the ascent they came across occasional flint pieces and porous sponge-like white lava with traces of iron. This useful metal, found across many parts of the world, might also occur in large quantities in these hills. The lava supported their assumption that this island, like others they had seen, was likely formed by an ancient volcanic eruption. A native accompanied them, carrying a small supply of food. From the summit, their guide pointed out areas across the sea where he claimed other islands lay, although these were beyond visible range. To the west, he said, lay Mopiha, and roughly to the southwest, another named Wenua Aura. According to the man, both were circular coral reefs with palm trees and no inhabitants, visited only occasionally from surrounding islands. These likely corresponded to the islands discovered by Captain Wallace and later named Lord Howe's and Scilly Island. By midday, the travelers had returned from the mountain, just as the two captains arrived back on board. They had previously watched a grand theatrical dance performed by the island's noble women. Since the heat was intense, the party hurried back to the ship, Both vessels were surrounded by numerous canoes, many with high-ranking passengers, who offered large quantities of bark cloth in exchange for small nails. Among the local women, the glass beads were highly prized as ornaments, but proved far less effective as trade goods compared to nails. The sailors could barely obtain fruit for them, even though such produce was generally the cheapest item. In Tahiti, however, such trinkets were valued much more. Could this heightened interest in decoration and glitter on that island perhaps indicate a greater level of general prosperity? After all, wealth often leads to extravagance. The heat lasted so intensely throughout the rest of the day that the crew couldn't go ashore again until sunset. They landed at the water place, where a small tupapau, a funeral shelter, stood. Under its simple frame lay a dead body, raised on a platform. This burial site lay within a dense grove of shady trees. Georg had never seen such a funeral place on this or any of the previous islands. He was astonished that the body was so carelessly left to decay and exposed to the elements. All around, the ground was strewn with human skulls and bones. He would gladly have spoken with a local about this custom, but no one was in sight. Georg wandered the area for some time without meeting anyone. Later, he learned that the entire population of this district had gathered at their chief's residence, where the sound of drums had announced another Hiwa, a public dance. The islanders placed great importance on these entertainments and traveled from distant parts to attend them. The peaceful evening and the beauty of the landscape made the walk especially pleasant. The absence of people created a solitude so deep that Georg almost felt he had landed on an enchanted island. Eventually, the party met a few natives inland. One of them appeared to be an intelligent man, and they asked him about neighboring islands. The man named 9, Mopiha, Wenua Aura, Adiha, Tautipa, Wawan, Ubaru, Tabuai, Auhaiau, and Rorotoa. The first two had already been mentioned earlier by another guide. The man now explained that, except for Adiha, which was only occasionally visited, all the others were inhabited. According to him, Ubaru was a Wenua, a high island, while the others were Motu, flat islands made of coral reefs. But these reports did little to satisfy the crew's curiosity. They therefore turned to Raiatea for clearer information. The district chief came aboard the next morning with his son Tehaiura and several other local leaders. Their account only partially agreed with what the previous day's guide had said. Of the 9 islands mentioned earlier, they only confirmed the 1st, 2nd, 7th, and 9th. They insisted that the 2nd island was indeed inhabited. Additionally, they spoke of 2 more islands, Wario, or Raiatea, described as large, and Orimatara. Both were said to be permanently settled. However, when asked about the exact location and distance of these islands, the men gave conflicting answers. In fact, none of them had ever visited those places themselves. As vague as these reports were, they still offered a clue. The islanders must have once been more active in seafaring, even if they no longer traveled as much now. This aligned with what was known of Tupaia, the Tahitian who had boarded the Endeavour during an earlier expedition. He had listed a far greater number of islands and had even drawn a map showing their names, sizes, and locations. Georg had received a copy of this chart from Lieutenant Pickersgill. In certain respects, the map seemed plausible. All the island names discussed so far appeared on it, except for Ubaru and Tubuai. However, the distances and positions were clearly inaccurate. If they had been correct, the crew would have encountered several of those islands during their later voyage, but they had not. It seemed likely, then, that Tupaia had created the chart from imagination to enhance his reputation for knowledge and insight. He may even have invented some of the names, for he had listed more than 50. Raiatea and his son had breakfast with the officers. After receiving generous return gifts, the 2 men returned ashore. Not long after, the visitors followed. Their host had invited them to witness a dramatic dance, a Hiwa, which they gladly accepted, having never seen one before.
That brings us to the end of episode S1-E28 in Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. You'll find a map with all key locations of this episode in the show notes. If you'd like to see what these places look like today, visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I retrace Forster's steps and explore connections between the past and present. Our expedition with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the Resolution will continue soon. Until then, thank you for coming along. After all, life is a journey. Being part of it is everything.